In the 70s country music outlaw revolution, the name Glaser was synonymous with rebellion and innovation. In the legendary band the Glaser Brothers, the world remembers Tompall, the charismatic frontman. But they often forget Jim, the younger brother whose golden voice shaped much of their sound. This is the paradoxical story of a man who spent his entire life in the band's shadow, then suddenly rose to the top. That success earned him the Best New Male Vocalist award, an ironic title for a veteran of more than 20 years. So how did someone who reached such heights of glory fade into obscurity? This is the story of Jim Glaser and his lifelong struggle to find a name for himself out of the shadow of his family. To understand the journey of Jim Glaser, you have to understand the place that forged him and his brothers. It wasn't the hard scrabble hills of Kentucky or the dusty plains of Texas. It was Spalding, Nebraska, a small farming town in the vast, windswept heart of the American Midwest. Jim was born there in 1936, the youngest of the three Glaser boys. Their father was a farmer, and their life was one of hard work, governed by the relentless cycle of planting and harvest. It was a world away from the music business, a place of profound quiet and deep-rooted family values. But in this quiet place, an extraordinary sound was being born. From a very young age, the three brothers, Tompall, the oldest and the natural leader, Chuck, the middle brother, with a keen mind for business and arrangement, and Jim, the youngest with the pure, soaring tenor voice, discovered they could sing together in a way that was almost magical. They honed their craft not in smoky bars, but in the pews of the local church, their voices blending in perfect, intricate harmony. Their sound was a unique fusion of the tight vocal arrangements of post-war pop groups, like the Four Freshmen, and the raw, honest emotion of the country music they heard crackling over the radio from the grand ole Opry. This duality, the sophisticated, almost jazz-like complexity of their harmonies, and the down-to-earth soul of their delivery, would become their lifelong trademark. The America they grew up in during the 1940s and 50s was a nation in transition. The big band era was fading, and a new generation of solo stars was rising. In Nashville, the country music industry was becoming more and more polished. Producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley were crafting the Nashville sound, a smooth, pop-inflected style with lush string sections and gentle background vocals, designed to appeal to a broader, more suburban audience. It was a sound that was professional, clean, and highly controlled. The raw, gritty honky-tonk of Hank Williams was being sanded down, made safe for mass consumption. It was into this highly structured, almost corporate world that three farm boys from Nebraska, with their strange, intricate harmonies and independent spirit, were about to walk. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't just going to Nashville to join the club. They were destined to help burn it down. The story of the Glaser brothers' assault on Nashville began in the late 1950s. Armed with little more than their guitars and their otherworldly vocal blend, they made the pilgrimage to Music City. The initial years were a struggle. They were outsiders, not just geographically, but musically. Their harmonies were too complex, too busy for the straightforward tastes of many Nashville producers. They weren't quite country, not quite pop. They were something else entirely, and the industry didn't know what box to put them in. They scraped by, playing small clubs and writing songs. Their big break came not as stars, but as the secret weapon behind the stars. The legendary Marty Robbins was the first to recognize the unique power of their voices. He hired them as his backup singers, and their soaring harmonies became an integral part of his sound on classic hits like El Paso. Suddenly, the Glazers were everywhere, even if nobody knew their names. They became the go-to harmony group in town, lending their voices to recordings by Johnny Cash, Patsy Cline, and Waylon Jennings. If you were a major star in Nashville in the 1960s, there was a good chance that the rich, complex vocal sound on your record was coming from three brothers from Nebraska. Jim, with his pure, emotive tenor, was often the anchor of this sound. He possessed a remarkable voice, capable of both immense power and delicate vulnerability. He was also emerging as a gifted songwriter. In 1966, the brothers finally broke through as artists in their own right with the song Gone, a haunting ballad that showcased their stunning vocal interplay. But it was a song Jim wrote that truly put them on the map. It was called Streets of Baltimore. Streets of Baltimore is a masterpiece of country storytelling, a heartbreaking tale of a man who gives up his farm and his entire way of life to follow his wife's dream of living in the big city, only to lose her to the city's temptations. Bobby Bare recorded the song in 1966, and it became a massive career-defining hit. It was later recorded by Graham Parsons, who turned it into a country rock standard. The song cemented Jim Glaser's reputation as one of Nashville's most insightful and empathetic songwriters. He had a gift for capturing the quiet desperation and noble sacrifices of ordinary people. The Glaser Brothers were now stars. They had a string of hits in the late 60s and early 70s, and they became members of the Grand Ole Opry. They had successfully conquered Nashville on their own terms. But for Tompall, and by extension his brothers, simply being part of the system wasn't enough. They wanted to build their own system. The dawn of the 1970s saw a rebellion brewing in Nashville. A new generation of artists, led by Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, was chafing under the rigid control of the major record labels and their polished production formulas. They wanted creative freedom. They wanted to use their own bands in the studio, to record the songs they wanted to record, the way they wanted to record them. This was the birth of the Outlaw movement, and at the absolute epicenter of this earthquake was the Glaser Brothers' own recording studio. They bought a building on 19th Avenue South in Nashville and christened it Glaser Sound Studios. But it would become known to history by a much more evocative name, Hillbilly Central. It wasn't just a studio, it was a clubhouse, a sanctuary, a pirate ship for the outlaws. It was a place where Waylon, Willie, Chris Christopherson, and other renegades could escape the watchful eyes of the corporate suits and create music on their own terms. The atmosphere was loose, creative, and notoriously wild. Tompall Glaser, with his fiery personality and defiant attitude, became the movement's spiritual guru. But Jim was right there, an essential if quieter part of the scene. He was the soulful songwriter, the steadying musical presence amidst the chaos. He co-wrote songs, sang harmony on countless outlaw tracks, and absorbed the spirit of artistic independence that defined the era. The Glaser brothers weren't just participating in the outlaw movement. They were helping to finance and facilitate it. Their success as mainstream artists gave them the capital and the clout to build the very fortress from which the rebellion was launched. In 1976, the movement reached its zenith with the release of the album Wanted the Outlaws, featuring Waylon, Willie, Jesse Coulter, and Tompall Glaser. It became the very first country album to be certified platinum, selling over 1 million copies, and it proved that the Outlaws weren't just a fringe movement. They were the new establishment. The brothers were at the peak of their influence. They were hit makers, Opry members, and revolutionary kingpins. But the same independent, often volatile spirit that fueled their rebellion also contained the seeds of their own destruction. The intense pressures of running the studio, combined with the notoriously hard-living lifestyle of the outlaw scene, began to take its toll. By the late 1970s, the three brothers, each with a strong, distinct personality, found it increasingly difficult to work together. The once magical harmony began to fracture under the weight of creative differences and personal friction. The Glaser Brothers, the band that had fought so hard to do things their own way, decided to break up and go their separate ways. For Jim Glaser, the man with the golden voice, it was time to step out of the shadow of his family name and see if he could make it on his own. The journey of a solo artist is a lonely one, and for Jim Glaser, the road after the Glaser Brothers was long and difficult. He had the voice, he had the songwriting talent, and he had the reputation. But for years, commercial success eluded him. He released a series of singles in the late 70s and early 80s that failed to make a significant impact on the charts. It was a frustrating, humbling experience for a man who had been at the top of the industry. He was no longer part of a famous trio. He was just another singer trying to get his song played on the radio. Then, in 1983, he recorded a song he had written called "You're Gettin' to Me Again." It wasn't a typical country song for the era. It had a unique atmospheric production with a haunting pop-infused melody. His vocal performance was a master class in subtlety and emotion. The record label, Noble Vision, released it, but initially it seemed destined for the same fate as his other solo efforts. It languished on the lower rungs of the charts. But then, a strange and wonderful thing happened. A handful of radio stations kept playing it. Listeners started calling in, requesting it. The song refused to die. It began a slow, almost agonizingly gradual climb up the Billboard charts. Week after week, it would inch a little higher. It took nearly a full year, an eternity in the music business, but in early 1984, the impossible happened. "You're Gettin' to Me Again," the song that wouldn't quit, reached #1 on the country charts. After years of struggle, Jim Glaser, at the age of 47, was a solo star. The industry was stunned. In the spring of 1984, at the Academy of Country Music Awards, Jim Glaser's name was called as the winner of the award for Best New Male Vocalist. It was a moment of incredible, almost unbelievable triumph. Here was a man who had been a professional musician for nearly 30 years, who had sung on countless hits, who was a member of the Grand Ole Opry, and he was being honored as the Best New Artist of the Year. The award was a testament to his perseverance, a validation of his unique talent, and the culmination of a lifelong dream to be recognized, not as one of the Glaser brothers, but as Jim Glaser. It was the absolute peak of his professional life, a perfect Hollywood ending to a long and winding story. But in the real world, the story doesn't always end at the climax. The spotlight that had taken so long to find him began, almost immediately, to drift away. His follow-up singles, like the beautifully written "The Man in the Mirror," were critically acclaimed, but failed to achieve the same commercial success. The unique pop-leaning sound that had made "You're Gettin' to Me Again" a hit also made him difficult to categorize for country radio, which was then moving towards a more traditional sound. The momentum from his incredible win slowly dissipated. The man who had been crowned the Best New Artist of the Year found himself, just a year or two later, struggling once again to get his music heard. His solo career, which had flared so brightly for one incredible moment, began to fade. The shadow he had worked so hard to escape began to creep back in. Jim Glaser was a man of quiet dignity and deep artistic integrity. He wasn't a flashy showman or a charismatic rebel like his brother Tompall. He was a craftsman, a songwriter, a vocalist of rare talent. Those who knew him describe a man who was thoughtful, intelligent, and deeply committed to the emotional truth of a song. His voice, that powerful, pure tenor, was his gift. but his personality was perhaps ill-suited to the demands of solo stardom. His brief moment at the top in 1984 was the result of a perfect storm, a truly unique song, a persistent record label, and a public that was momentarily captivated by a new sound. But building a sustainable solo career requires more than just one hit. It requires a consistent image, a powerful marketing machine, and often a willingness to play the industry game. Jim was, at his core, an artist, not a product. He was content to let the music speak for itself. When country radio moved on, he didn't change his style to chase the trends. He simply continued to write and sing the songs he believed in. The relationship between the Glaser brothers, like many family relationships, was a complex mix of love, loyalty, and discord. Together they achieved incredible things, but their individual personalities were completely different. Tompall was the fire, Chuck was the brain, and Jim was the soul. This interaction created a powerful creative force, but it also made it inevitable that they would eventually go their separate ways. John Hartford, the legendary musician and musician who was a close friend and admirer of the brothers, once said of their harmony, "It was a sound you couldn't hear anywhere else, as it was a family thing." That family thing was both their greatest strength and Jim's greatest challenge. How do you establish your own identity when your voice is so closely tied to your brother's? Even his greatest solo achievement was tinged with this irony. The song "You're Getting to Me Again" was a triumph for Jim Glaser, the individual. But to many, he was still Jim Glaser of the Glaser Brothers. His past was so legendary that it threatened to overshadow his present. In an interview from that period, you can hear a quiet pride in his voice, but also a sense of weariness. After decades of being part of a collective, the burden of being a solo artist, of carrying the entire show on your own shoulders, was immense. The tragedy of Jim Glaser's career is not that he wasn't talented enough to be a superstar. It's that the industry, and perhaps even the public, could never fully see him outside the context of the legendary band he came from. The flame of Jim Glaser's solo career, which had roared to life so spectacularly in 1984, slowly dwindled to an ember. He continued to record and release albums on smaller independent labels throughout the 80s and 90s, but he never again found a home on mainstream country radio. His music remained a fixture for a small, dedicated group of fans who appreciated his artistry, but to the wider world, he had become a one-hit wonder, a name attached to a single memorable song. This label is, of course, a profound injustice. A man who wrote Streets of Baltimore, who sang Harmony for Johnny Cash, who was a key figure in the Outlaw movement, and a member of the Grand Ole Opry for decades, could never be defined by a single hit. But in the simplified narrative of popular music history, nuance is often the first casualty. He never seemed bitter about his fate. He continued to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, a beloved and respected member of the family, long after his chart-topping days were over. He had won his award. He had reached the top of the mountain, if only for a moment. And for a man as humble as Jim Glaser, perhaps that was enough. He had proven to the world and to himself that the quietest brother had a voice that deserved to be heard on its own. On April 6, 2019, the music stopped for Jim Glaser. He died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 82. His death was covered with respect by the music press, and an obituary in Nashville's The Tennessean celebrated his long and influential career. At the Grand Ole Opry, friends and colleagues mourned the loss of another family member, another living link to their illustrious past. But outside that close circle, the news of his passing barely resonated. There was no national shock wave, no social media tributes, as is often the case when a modern star dies. But to say that no one noticed is not entirely accurate. The real reaction to Jim Glaser's death was not the lack of headlines, but the quiet, scattered corners of the internet where his music still lives on. On classic country music forums and in Facebook groups dedicated to his heyday fans, the news was shared with genuine sadness. Fans, mostly older, didn't create trending hashtags. Instead, they shared memories. The comments weren't empty rhetoric, but personal recollections. I still remember the first time I heard "You're Getting to Me Again" on the radio, one person wrote. His voice in the Glaser Brothers was the most perfect harmony. It was a poignant but personal tribute. It wasn't a storm of global grief, but rather a myriad of small, gentle streams of memories, all flowing to one source, that unmistakable golden voice. Ultimately, the passing of the former best new male vocalist was a quiet affair, a final moving reflection on a career deeply felt by those who knew it, but out of the limelight of the wider world. Perhaps the best way to understand Jim Glaser's legacy is to look at his most glorious moment, standing alone on stage accepting the ACM Award for Best New Artist. It was an incredible victory, a testament to his perseverance after years of struggle, but it was also a tragic reminder of a bitter truth. Even at his peak, he could not completely escape the shadow of one of Nashville's most revolutionary family bands. And that legacy is 1/3 of the Glaser Brothers, the heart and soul behind the Outlaw Rebellion, is indelible. His voice defined an era. His story is not just about success or failure. It's about the struggle to find a name for himself in a world that loves easy legends. He is a reminder of all the quiet talents, the craftsmen who build the foundations for the bigger stars to shine. Jim Glaser is not a forgotten superstar. He is a true artist who had his moment. He was a king, and that is a legacy worth remembering, a name worth calling home.